Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The Gilded Age Governments and Political Economy. The topics we want to cover in this lecture including governing the cities, the political economy of the Gilded Age, governing the nation, and civil service reform. Let's begin by talking about cities. The growth of large cities was unruly and dramatic because of industrialization and immigration. Antebellum cities were governed by political machines like the well-known Tammany Hall of Manhattan that divided cities into districts, wards, and precincts. These machines operated via political patronage, that is, ward healers and precinct captains employed by the dominant political party dispensed jobs and welfare, and they did favors in exchange for votes. Now, this was not out-and-out vote selling, but an informal understanding that the patron-client relationship would cease if the party in power lost the election, and the new party would fire many city workers and give their own people those jobs. At the top, influence peddling and concentration of power led, in many cases, to graft and corruption. This system extended into the Gilded Age and into the Progressive Era as well. Now, political bosses ran these shows, and bossism wasn't limited to one particular party. The most famous political boss was William Tweed of Tammany, a Democrat who was finally arrested for corruption in 1871, which is a bit before our period. He and his henchmen looted the public treasury of somewhere between $20 million and $200 million of that era. Another example of political bossism is Cincinnati, Ohio, which from the 1880s until 1912 was run by boss George Cox, a Republican. And Mark Hanna, Republican advisor to President McKinley and senator from Ohio, was the closest thing the U.S. had to a national political boss. When he died in 1904, Theodore Roosevelt was able to begin taking over the reins of the GOP, initiating the idea that the president was the leader of the political party, though it took until after the New Deal to cement that notion in place. Let's talk now about the political economy of the Gilded Age. Industrial and financial capitalism replaced Republican idealism, not the party, but this concept of republicanism from the 18th century, as the driver of national politics. That is, we talk about so-called Republican virtue, and that's a concept that arose in the 18th century with Whig philosophies of government that the Americans picked up on and created their political system around. This Republican virtue emphasized the power of middle-sized landholders and small businesses engaging in subsistence agriculture and the kind of businesses that were really kind of buying your own job. These businesses and subsistence agriculture smallholders had some interaction with the market economy. They were local in scale and scope. This ideology of Republican virtue emphasized relative equality of size and opportunity, and it promoted low barriers to entry into individual businesses. Compare these to the ideology of industrial and financial capitalism. Giant corporations were the leading edge of the economy, and they began to have political sway. There was across the economy a drive for full participation in the market economy at the national and the international level. Businesses produced goods. The worker's place was to provide labor, so there was this bifurcation between the producer of goods and the worker who simply provided the labor, and everyone else fulfilled their role as a consumer. Inequality was cooked into the system, as were high and rising barriers to entry into competitive businesses. Now, the national government in this changing economy led to a division of labor, according to economic historian Richard Bensel in his book, The Political Economy of American Industrialization. The money supply was usually spearheaded by the president. Creating a national market fell to the Supreme Court, that is the infrastructure for a national market. And funding the government and the endeavors of these other two branches of government fell to Congress as a matter of tariff and pensions. And we must talk a bit about civil service reform that could only occur once the new political economy was more or less settled and on its way. Although at that time there seemed to be no connection between civil service reform and industrialization. With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can see that these two things are created, though this lecture will not go into that very much. Let's look at the 6 presidents of the Gilded Age. A problem that modern American historians have is that they tend to focus, like I am here, on periodization by presidential terms of office. Well, I try to break away from that, but we can't simply ignore who the presidents were. These are people you probably will never remember unless you really do focus on American history and this era, because these are weak presidents. The presidency at this point was a weak institution, unlike in the 20th and 21st century, and these American presidents are not nobodies, but they are like those presidents between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, people of smaller stature. Let's look at these guys, though. Rutherford B. Hayes was the first president of our period, having been elected in 1877, not 76. The election was held in 76, but it went to the House of Representatives, and the compromise that gave the presidency to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for his removing federal troops from the South then led to him becoming president. James Garfield, well liked throughout the nation, was his replacement in 1881, but as we'll talk about in a moment, lived only a few months and was assassinated. Chester Arthur, who had been the noticeably corrupt comptroller of the Port of New York, had become vice president and then ascended to the presidency. He was replaced by Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, who was the only president to ever serve 2 non-consecutive terms. In between Cleveland's 2 terms, Benjamin Harrison, grandson of another President Harrison, also served, and then William McKinley served until he too was assassinated in 1901. As I've said, the money question and the gold standard, that is the money supply, was controlled by presidents working with Congress. The gold standard was established between 1873 and 1879 in industrialized countries around the world. They went to the gold standard, a single metal standard of value of the currency. Congress fluctuated between supporting gold alone and supporting silver as money. And so Congress passed a couple of acts designed to force the U.S. government to buy silver. The first of these was the Bland-Allison Act of 1878 that required the Mint to purchase $2 million of silver per month, but did not require monetarizing any of it. Now, some of the silver was minted into silver dollars, but not very much. Bland-Allison was supported by the silver mining interests of the West, especially in the wake of the exploitation of the Comstock lode in Nevada that was the largest silver strike in American history. In 1890, as part of a package of bills that included the Sherman Antitrust Act, Congress passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act that required Congress to buy $4 million of silver per month and to monetize most of it. Now, this had the perverse effect of driving gold out of the country. Creditors, usually British banking interests who held excessive amounts of gold certificates, that is bonds, feared they would be paid in silver, which no other country, particularly England, recognized as money. So they redeemed their bonds and their certificates in gold, thus depleting the amount of gold that was in Fort Knox. This drove the U.S. money supply down, and it drove the U.S. into a depression beginning in 1893 before the Cleveland administration had the opportunity to have that law repealed. Presidents were always gold bugs, even the Democrat Cleveland. They effectively managed the gold standard, especially considering they had almost none of the statistical or modeling tools to judge economic performance that we have today. Budget surpluses allowed Congress to enforce the purchase of silver. Thus, silver purchases were really a price support program for silver mines. The president countered Congress on continued attempts to pass pro-silver or anti-gold acts. Now, the national market fell to the Supreme Court, which created the rules of how states would interact with these new large corporations. And it was the point of the Supreme Court to replace regional markets with an expanding nationwide set of markets for various products and various industries. There was a tendency in the Supreme Court to overrule state attempts to control interstate industry, which many states had tried to do as these large corporations began to operate in more than one state. The railroads are a good example. And in the case Wabash Railway versus Illinois in 1886, the Supreme Court made railroad regulation by state impossible. They bundled together a bunch of similar cases, and this was called the Wabash Railway case, which led the federal courts to rule that states were not allowed to set rail rates on intrastate traffic. They could set the rates, but they couldn't set them too low. That was an unlawful taking of property in the form of profit. There were precedents to allow rights to corporations outside the traditional control of governments. Some of these were rulings against rate-making power at the state level. Some were rulings of rate-making power with the Interstate Commerce Commission. For example, the head note to the case Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad of 1886, and the head note is the only thing that still exists, as the sole copy of the order itself was destroyed after the head note was made, implied that courts decided that corporations are legal persons entitled to due process protection under the 14th Amendment. So as legal persons entitled to due process, they could not have their property in the form of profit taken away from them by governmental entities unless they were being fined. In another case, the U.S. versus E.C. Knight Company of 1895, the Supreme Court limited application of the Sherman Antitrust Act in breaking up monopolies of manufacturers, even though a monopoly in the sugar trust under E.C. Knight controlled multiple sugar factories and controlled multiple sugar outlets around the United States. The Supreme Court said that the Sherman Antitrust Act only applied to interstate commerce, not interstate manufacturing. Paying for all of this was controlled by Congress. Now, most of the taxes collected in the United States at the national level were in the form of tariffs. This was before the income tax as we understand it today. Tariffs were both protective and revenue generating. Now, a protective tariff means that the tariff, which is a tax on foreign goods, would be high enough to ensure that American prices could stay high enough to allow American products to compete in the United States against low-priced foreign products. This was kind of an artificial support for American companies to be able to produce their products and to sell them in the United States. Revenue-generating tariffs means that the tariffs produced tax money that ran the government. Every Congress dealt with tariffs, just like they now do with the income tax laws. Tariffs were an object of political partisanship, and there were no real economic analysts to test the impact of tariff policy. Industries with political pull ended up being protected, while those without political pull were harmed. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 was the high point of U.S. tariff rates, setting some as high as 48%. That means that if a good that was covered by the tariff came into the United States, a tax of 48% of its price was tacked onto it so that a comparable American-made good could charge 48% more and come in a little bit under the price of the imported good. This was so high that it left the government with embarrassing revenue surpluses that many in the South and the West, who paid for high tariffs more than people in the industrialized Northeast, argued should be distributed or the tariffs should be reduced. Money from tariffs were used to fund U.S. Civil War veterans' pensions. Usually, this money went to people in the West and the North, but not to the South. The states themselves, not the federal government, funded small Confederate pensions. Now, there was blocks of support for high tariff rates. One of these blocks was Union veterans and their dependents who wanted more and more money put into pensions. There was another block as well, industrial workers whose jobs depended on high prices due to tariffs. Let's shift gears to talk about civil service reform. City, state, and federal governments ran according to the Jacksonian notion of to the victor go the spoils. That is, government jobs at all levels were filled by political appointees. Abraham Lincoln famously complained about the amount of time he had to spend on job seekers while the states were seceding and the Civil War was about to begin. In the late 1870s, particularly after the trial and imprisonment of Boss Tweed and the exposure of rings of corruption in the Ulysses S. Grant administration, a movement began to establish quote-unquote objective hiring policies like exams for competence and the employment protections for federal job holders so they couldn't be fired on the whim of the next administration. The National Civil Service Reform League, founded in 1881, was one of the most important of these good government or GUGU reform movements. In the 1884 election, jumping ahead just a little bit, civil service reform got a jolt from the activities of the so-called mugwumps. These are Republicans who bolted the party because of the corruption of the GOP candidate James Blaine for president. But the mugwumps, including Mark Twain and William Graham Sumner, had reason to bolt. Let's go back a little bit. In 1880, the GOP dominated the government, but it split into two wings over the questions of civil service. One wing was called the half-breeds, who wanted reform, and the other was called the stalwarts, who wanted to retain the spoils system. In the heat of this fight, 1881, a job seeker and strong stalwart named Charles Guiteau, shown in the cartoon here, assassinated the half-breed president, the reformist president, James Garfield. Now, Guiteau thought his act of assassination would let the stalwarts win and would actually bring him adulation from the American people who wanted to stop the government from fighting over this issue of civil service reform. Well, he was sadly mistaken to the point of delusion, but he even maintained his delusion as he was mounting the stairs to the gallows for his execution by hanging. The reforming half-breeds got the advantage and by 1883 had passed the Pendleton Service Reform Act, but its implementation was slow to a crawl by obstruction from the stalwarts. This led to the bolt of the mugwumps in 1884 and the election of Democrat Grover Cleveland, who more rapidly spread federal civil service throughout its job system. So in summary, not only did industrialization change the U.S. economy, it changed how the U.S. political system operated. That system had to make space for effective economic operation, and the political systems tended to support the leading edge of the economy. The government had to manage the money supply, manage tax policy, and manage the spread of this nationwide market. According to Richard Bensel, different branches of the government took on these different tasks. Nevertheless, government was still political, and like the city machines, operated on the spoils system that exchanged votes for economic largesse, including exchanging votes for jobs. This began to change slowly with civil service reform that implemented tests for competence before a job applicant could be appointed. Well, this then ends the lecture. And as always, thank you for your attention.